I don't think Putin is a man with a lot of time for the ambitions that he has. I mean, I think he waited 10 years of kind of this hybrid invasion in the Donbas to see if he could get it. It wasn't working, and he feels like he's an older guy that's running out of time, and he wants to achieve his Tsarist ambitions before he goes. So even if he waits a kind of 6 months or a year, he's still going to come back, I think, and try and subjugate Ukraine completely.
From a tactical level, the Russians, the amount they've advanced has been painfully very, very slow indeed, and they describing them as winning is difficult from a military perspective.
Hello and welcome to the special edition of Frontline for Times Radio. And Philip and I are joined today by Maxim Tucker, the Times' Ukraine correspondent. We're going to take this moment to have a look back at 2025. We're going to discuss some of the key moments of the war this year, how it's being fought on the ground, in the air and at sea, and felt well beyond the borders of Ukraine. And we're also going to review the exhaustive diplomatic efforts to bring an end to the fighting. So let's just start by sort of taking a look at what is going on the ground. Maxim, do you want to fill us in how you see the situation on the battlefield at the moment?
So it's continued the trend of this year of the Russians being on the front foot and having the momentum and pushing forward against Ukrainian forces, particularly focusing on the town of Pokrovsk, but also further north in the Kharkiv region of Kupiansk and driving Ukrainian forces out of the Kursk region as well. However, we have seen in the last week some success by the Ukrainian forces in Kupiansk, and they've mounted a remarkable operation to surround the Russian troops inside Kupiansk and seem to have had a very effective counteroffensive which has stopped the Russians there. And Pokrovsk has yet to completely fall to the Russians. Now, Putin has claimed that he controls both cities several times, and the Ukrainians have been able to expose those claims as false, with Zelensky even appearing outside Kupiansk and filming a selfie outside Kupiansk and showing that it was not in Russian hands. So I think Ukrainians are determined to show that the war is not over, that the Russians are not going to dictate the terms of any peace settlement, and show their allies that it's not time to give up yet.
And the human cost, it's been absolutely huge, hasn't it?
Human cost is massive. Up to date, and these are Ukrainian MOD estimates, but they're backed by US and UK intelligence. The Russians have lost about 1.2 million troops. That's dead or wounded, but the majority of the wounded are not being treated well, so they're dying. Ukrainians, it's much more difficult to get an accurate number, and I've heard 80,000, but the Ukrainians don't put their casualty figures out, and the West doesn't then report their casualty figures. And if it is 80,000, that'll be 80,000 dead. It's likely to be significantly more than that as we're going through. And I was going to say, from a tactical level, the Russians, the amount they've advanced has been painfully very, very slow indeed, and they describing them as winning is difficult from a military perspective.
And we are now in round 3 of negotiations to try and bring an end to this conflict, and it just seems to be some endless cycle, doesn't it? I mean, it must be exhaustive, the process. Maxim, you've been following it each time, often been in Ukraine when it's been happening. I mean, how has that been lived in the country itself?
I mean, the Ukrainian position, I think, is to try and go along with the peace talks, do everything that's asked of them by the US in order to keep supplies, military aid supplies flowing. Now, this is now supplies from European partners, not funded by the US, but funded by Europe, but purchased from the US. And this crucial intelligence sharing, which is so important for Ukrainians in understanding when the Russians launch a ballistic missile, or understanding where Russian troop positions are, or where Russian are concentrating their forces. So that's really critical. And they're going along with these negotiations. I think the Ukrainians don't expect there to be a meaningful peace, because they know that the Russians don't see, and Putin has again repeated this week, Ukraine as a sovereign nation. He sees it as part of historical Russian lands. And that hasn't changed since the beginning. So anything that is less than Ukraine's complete submission to Russia is not going to be acceptable to the Russians. And the latest proposal, which is the US idea, but informed by Europeans and gone back now to the Russians, is that there would be a peacekeeping force of some kind, European, in Ukraine. There would be a NATO-style guarantee, security guarantee of some kind of reaction from those forces. And that, of course, is not going to be acceptable to the Russians. So it's another round if we expect the Russians to come back and say no. And then it's really a question of, again, what kind of pressure is the Trump administration going to put on Ukraine?
And all the while, the economy in Ukraine is creaking, isn't it? I mean, this effort to get the release of the frozen Russian assets that's been ongoing for months now. I have read somewhere that if they don't actually get some kind of funding soon, that they won't keep the lights on in a few months' time. By this time next year, it's going to be, I mean, it's a critical situation, isn't it?
It is a critical situation, and that's why there's so much effort being put by the EU and the element of the coalition, the willing, to try and get the Belgians to help the release of this, the $200 billion of the $300 billion of Russian frozen assets that are in the West, and to use at least a big chunk of that to, as you say, keep the lights on in Ukraine, keep paying their civil servants and their troops that are in the front line, and keep being able to keep civilian infrastructure going. It's not paying for weapons, because the EU and the coalition, the willing, are paying for the weapons, whether they're coming from European sources or whether they're being purchased from the Americans and supplied in or sourced elsewhere, because they're sourcing all across the world.
So, Maxim, if we wind the clocks back now and take a review of the year, January, when we were all anticipating the administration, the new administration in the US, and the impact that that would have on the war in Ukraine, on the ground, Russian forces, they were advancing in the east, and Ukraine had renewed its offensive operations in Russia's Kursk region. How did it all look to you at the time, Maxim?
Well, I think as soon as we saw that Trump had been elected, we knew that changes were coming, and it was a very worrying situation for the Ukrainians and anyone that's paid attention to Trump's attitude to Ukraine and Russia throughout his political life. So it was really a very nervous month where people was trying to figure out what the Trump administration would do, how severe the pressure would be on Ukraine to come to some kind of peace deal, how what the relationships or the kind of reset would be between Trump and Putin. And unfortunately, a lot of the things that we feared have come to pass. You know, the first meeting that Zelensky and Trump had in the Oval Office, I think was shocking to the world. I mean, we could have anticipated Trump's attitude to Russia, but the pressure and the disrespect and the bullying of Zelensky by both Trump and Vance in an obviously pre-planned ambush was really, it's set the tone, I think, for the pressure that Zelensky has received from the US this year. And also this kind of determination that the Trump administration seems to have of replacing Zelensky who is still Ukraine's democratically elected leader.
And that instance in the Oval Office, I mean, everybody, made the headlines around the world, didn't it? And everyone's jaw-dropping moment. And it's kind of characterized the kind of flip-flop kind of public attitude towards the Ukrainians throughout the year, hasn't it?
It has, and Trump, depending on who he's been talking to last, seems to change his view. After that, you then get European leaders of the coalition, the willing, coming in and setting the conditions before he moves on elsewhere. Trump then goes and has his meeting in Alaska with Vladimir Putin, flip-flops back again, and then NATO leaders come in again to try and get him to change his mind. But what I found interesting about what happened in the Oval Office was the body language between the different Americans that were in there. Because if you saw, it was J.D. Vance that kicked it off. Donald Trump backed his vice president up, but Marco Rubio, who was the Secretary of State who's responsible for everything outside the United States and dealing with, sat there, and he was, you could see that he did not like and was not agreeing with what Vance was saying. And there's real tensions, I think, amongst Trump's top team, and that's been reflected again throughout a lot of the decision-making that's happened through the year.
Do you think, Maxim, that President Zelensky learned from that experience and learned very quickly?
I think you've seen him say thank you in every possible opportunity since then. He has learned that he needs to be as careful as he possibly can, and that the Americans don't see the war as the same way as the Europeans do. I think the Europeans have come round to understanding that this is a war that Ukraine is fighting, but it's on behalf of the whole of Europe, because if the Ukrainians don't stop Russia, what which army is going to be capable of stopping the Russians coming into Europe. And the Americans under the Trump administration see this as a very faraway conflict that's not really their problem, and also is getting in the way of great business deals with Russia that they would like to pursue for them and their friends. So I think that meeting set the tone for how Zelensky is going to have to conduct himself. And, you've even seen him, he was determined not to wear a suit. There's the symbolism of him wearing kind of combat style clothes to show that he is the leader of a country at war. He's now had to go to meetings kind of in a revamped look, which is not quite a full suit, but it is a kind of jacket, a formal look that he wasn't prepared to adopt before.
But, again, if anything happened in this, what it did was it forced the coalition of the willing to come together a little bit more, and also to get Europe to sit up and listen to something that Donald Trump, when he was president first time round, had turned around and criticised Europe for not standing up for its own defence. And everything that he's been doing the whole way through, he's been reinforcing that. And Europe has now suddenly realised that it's had to stand up, and we've got Keir Starmer from the United Kingdom, Emmanuel Macron from France, and Chancellor Merz from Germany, all getting together and starting to realise that they have to step up. That could be a good thing for Europe.
So, Maxim, moving on to March then, that the Coalition of the Willing was formed in February, and then we move on to March, and we have this really dark moment when US intelligence was halted for Ukraine. And this was in frustration, Donald Trump's perception of any progress in accepting the peace at that time. And it was seen as a true wake-up call in the attitude. I mean, how much of a difference did that make to Ukraine at the time for that brief period that it was stopped? And was it the thing that killed off the Kursk offensive?
I mean, it was a real power play, wasn't it? It was demonstrating how important US intelligence sharing is, because even though the Europeans can help with material military aid, you cannot replace the satellites that the US have and the ability that the US has in to see what's going on inside Russia and to share that with the Ukrainians. Certainly, it came at the same time as a turning point in the Kursk offensive, with the Russians being able to amass troops and move forward and to start driving the Ukrainians out. I think that offensive had been prepared for some time. It had clearly been prepared for some time. We saw the new drone tactics that were brought in, this kind of Rubicon Center, being able to deploy and attack Ukrainian logistics, much further out than they had been before, the start of fiber optic drones. So there were lots of kind of ingredients that made it possible to drive the Ukrainians out. And intelligence sharing, I think, was one of those. I mean, if the Ukrainians had been able to see Russian troop concentrations and hit them in that week, it would have made a big difference. So I think it played a role, but there was certainly a long build-up, I think, by the Russians to driving the Ukrainians out of Kursk, and they were very determined to do that, including bringing in the North Koreans.
Yeah. What surprised me most about whenever the intelligence sharing stopped was almost that day the Russians hit Ukraine with massive ballistic missile strikes, with drone strikes and everything else, almost as if they knew that the intelligence was going to be turned off, and that was a safe moment for them to attack Ukrainian civilian infrastructure as well as Ukrainian military infrastructure. And that is something that shocked me from an intelligence perspective.
That's interesting. Maxim, you mentioned North Korean troops, and you've written about these troops and the alliance between North Korea and Russia this year. How deep has that alliance become?
It's incredibly deep now. I think, the Russians have shared with the North Koreans ballistic missile developments, and they've massively improved the Koreans' ballistic missiles. I was talking to Air Force officers who'd been observing them being used in Ukraine, and they were saying the first ballistic missile fired by the North Koreans, a North Korean one, into Ukraine, missed by 15 kilometers. And then with the Russian technology, it's more like the Iskander missiles, they're becoming closer to kind of 50 meters accurate. And the North Koreans have obviously happily taken that technology home and will apply the lessons learned. And the troops played a role. They were an important role in Kursk because they were really determined, really focused, really motivated at a time when Russian troops' morale was low and also Ukrainian troops' morale was low. So they brought something different into the fight. They've learned a lot. The ones who survived obviously have gone back to North Korea and taken those lessons home. and will be training other troops, I'm sure, in the kind of new future of warfare, the drone warfare. But I think also what we've seen that's really important this year and the tail end of last is how much North Korean ammunition is being brought in to prop up the Russians who've been running low. I mean, the amount of ammunition that's used in this war is simply incredible. When you see it, it's just astonishing. The intensity of the fire in these battlefields, and also North Korean workers going into Russia to help produce on the production line of drones and things like that, and possibly reports of Russian drones being assembled in North Korea as well, where it's difficult for the Ukrainians to strike them.
Do you think North Korea is emerging as more of a threat as a result of the war in Ukraine and its involvement?
Oh, very much so. Kim Jong-un's being emboldened by this. You can see that. He's getting more money into his country that he can use. He's getting more accurate weapons. He's getting troops with combat experience, and therefore he will be focusing on how he can turn that into his threats and his ambitions, which are more focused on South Korea and Southeast Asia. So he's using this as much as he possibly can to gain from it what he can. But it's quite telling on the Russian defense industrial base that they cannot keep up their capacity, no matter what Vladimir Putin's saying. They're not keeping up with the output that's needed to support Russian activities in the war. And to have to rely on North Korea, their ammunition is still very unreliable indeed. I would not stand beside an artillery piece with North Korean shell in it and want to be anywhere near it with as the lanyard's pulled, because a lot of it is not leaving the end of the barrel.
Maxim, we spoke on the 20th of March after you'd been to the command centre for soldiers holding the line just south of Pokrovsk, the Da Vinci Wolves Brigade you spoke to. The battle to defend that city has been one of the toughest fought this year, hasn't it? How would you characterise the fighting along the front line this year in general?
I mean, yeah, it's been an incredibly tough 18-month battle, and it's still the focal point now. I think the soldiers there were saying that this is every few months the war changes, and this war is totally unrecognizable from how it was in 2022. You can't advance anywhere in the open. You're relegated to staying underground. I mean, all of the kind of infantry in the front lines now basically live like moles. They're hidden underground in twos or threes because they don't want to present a big target. They don't want to go outside. Drones are bringing in ammunition and supplies, and drones are evacuating the wounded because coming in and out of the positions is so incredibly dangerous. And anywhere now within 30 kilometers of the front line, you can expect to be targeted by a drone. And that has changed the war entirely. And I think, this amazing Ukrainian counteroffensives in the first year of the war, taking back Kherson and taking back Kharkiv and these kind of sweeping advances would just be impossible now because they'd be spotted and you'd be attacked in those columns very, very quickly. And they were saying that it's really become a war where it's about patience, it's about grit, it's about determination, and it's about endurance. And the Ukrainians are suffering from not having enough troops to rotate onto the front line because guys are staying there for about up to 90 days sometimes because it's so dangerous to evacuate them. And then they come back and they have a week's rest, and then they're asked to go again, and it's very, very difficult.
And the way the front line is defined is changing as well. There isn't a linear front line anymore. You get little pockets of Ukrainians, and there could be Russians further west than them. And therefore, our front line is little pockets of people all over the place, and it's not determined now by your forward line of own troops, and where direct fire weapons and your indirect fire weapons can influence. So it's very difficult to define. It's now defined in tens of kilometres by where the drones can influence, because drones are being used not just from a bombing perspective, but also effectively as a sniper rifle and taking individuals out.
Do you think that, Maxim, that what you're seeing and what Philip's describing there about the way the front line is in Ukraine is particular to this conflict?
Yeah, I think it's something that's developed as a result of the proliferation of drones, because you don't want to have concentrations of troops. You don't want anyone to know where your positions are. The most important thing is to be hidden. You can't have these big trench lines where it's obvious where your troops are, and drones are going to keep just hitting them and targeting them, even if they're well fortified. So I think that is and it's also, I think, a statement of where we are in the war now, where both sides are very fatigued, where they have not as many troops available to them as they would like, and they can't spare lots of guys to be holding a big trench line. They've only got enough numbers for 2 or 3 in crucial positions, who are often just sitting there listening or manning an observation post and reporting back to their drone commanders who to specify targets and things like that. And it's also it's specific to what the Russians are doing now, is that they've found it impossible to advance with their armored vehicles with these big targets, which will just instantly be attacked by drones and spotted by drones and then hit with artillery. So they are creeping forward in ones and twos by foot. And then the tactic is, to get behind the lines and try and concentrate there. And they've actively, I was talking to the 63rd Brigade in the Liman sector last time I was in Ukraine, and they said, these guys just try and get behind, and partly that's a psychological weapon, because people then realize that the enemy are in our rear and they feel like they have to retreat, even if it's only 2 Russian soldiers and actually there's 10 Ukrainian soldiers holding that position. So a lot of what these brigades have done now is I say, actually, no, we don't need to retreat. They're not really, it's just a small group of people in the rear, and we can continue to resupply you. And this is why you have this very odd picture of people saying, like Putin saying, I've taken Pokrovsk because our troops are in the center of Pokrovsk, but actually there's Ukrainian troops in a building in the basement across the road. So it gets a very, very confused picture of war now.
So,
well, I was going to say, and often these Russian troops that are 2 or 3, in Ukrainian rear have got their little flag with them.
Yeah,
they go out,
raise it up, yeah.
they get the selfie from the Russian drones that are there, knowing that that'll be geolocated, knowing that the open source intelligence analysts that are out there will go, we've geolocated the Russians to that position, and therefore they must have captured it.
It's very difficult to get a clear picture of what's going on, isn't it? I mean, that must have been particularly difficult for you throughout the year, Maxim, to really analyse what's going on, because you really can't get right to the zero line, can you, at all?
Right. Well, if you tried, you might well be intercepted by a Russian reconnaissance group or something like that. So it's become we were quite happy to go within 5 kilometers of the front line. I think the closest I was in during the Kharkiv, the Russian second offensive, was a mile from an infantry battle. And that just, there were drones already then, but there weren't as many. You still had jamming equipment, and you had, if you were with a unit that had good detectors, you could be quite relatively confident that they would find the drone and jam it. But now with fiber optic drones, if they spot you, then that's it. So getting within 30 kilometers of the front line is very, very difficult. You need to think about the unit that you're going with. You need to speak to them. And then at the end of the day, you're still taking a chance because you can still be spotted. And the number of times that we've heard drones and they've impacted near us is really quite alarming. It's definitely increasing as the war goes on.
So we're moving through the year, and when we get to spring, something that you were talking about a little bit earlier, Maxim, was this kind of transactional approach, the fact that the Trump administration wants to get down to business. And coupled with all of these kind of events on the battlefield, you've got this kind of undercurrent of business dealing that's going on throughout the whole year. And this is when there was the formal signing, the agreement between the US and Ukraine to establish this reconstruction investment fund to develop Ukraine's critical mineral oil, gas reserves on this minerals deal. That transactional approach was in full view there, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's all about Donald Trump wanting to do the deal. His book, The Art of the Deal, which he didn't write, but everything is about getting the deal done, doing a deal. And that doesn't sit well with the way diplomacy happens from the European leaders. President Zelensky is on the back foot, having been ambushed in February in the Oval Office, and therefore it's trying to change everyone's thinking to get that deal right.
Yeah, and I remember at the time when we were talking about it, Maxim, is that everybody was linking that to being some kind of security promise for Ukraine, and this was somehow shore up security in the event of a ceasefire. And I never quite understood how that was going to work.
Well, that was the Ukrainians' hope. That was what Zelensky had kind of offered Trump before even Trump came into office. He said, we have these minerals. Look, we can make some kind of deal that's going to be beneficial for the US. And the idea was that there would be a US investment in Ukrainian mineral extraction, and Ukraine would give some of the profits of that to the US, and those profits could be used to purchase weapons as well. So Ukraine would essentially be giving US profits in exchange for weapons. But I mean, it was a very long-term perspective, I think, because it's difficult to get a lot of these rare earth minerals out of the ground in Ukraine, particularly now there's such a heavy conflict in the areas where they're fighting. And I think it also, that episode speaks to what, as Philip alluded to earlier, the importance of the different figures. Like Scott Bessent was a very important figure in negotiating that. Obviously enjoyed a good relationship with Yulia Sviridenko, who was the economy minister and is now the prime minister of Ukraine. And they conducted that in a very business-like transaction. They had a very skilled set of negotiators. They had lawyers on both sides. They were paying attention to the detail, and they really did it properly. And then on the other hand, you have these negotiations which are going on now with Kirill Dmitriev and Steve Witkoff, who are not detailed people. They are kind of real estate developers and sovereign wealth fund investors, and they are not interested in the finer points of how this will work or what are the problems or the drawbacks of it. They just want to force through a deal done, and it's really, a lot of it is about optics, I think.
An element of that, especially when we talk about rare earth metals, is indicative of other things that are bothering Donald Trump. Because we remember when he first came in, he started threatening Greenland. And as he was threatening Greenland, a lot of the talk was about the rare earth minerals that were under the ground in Greenland. And then the deal in Ukraine is all about access to rare earth metals. And of course, Donald Trump's principal foreign policy focus is on China. China controls 90% of the economic output of rare earth metals around the world, and owns 100% of some of the mines that provide some of the really critical rare earth minerals that are needed for all the electronics we use, including military electronics. And that's what Donald Trump seems to be seized by. And this is a recurring theme that's coming up in everything that he's doing. So, I wasn't surprised when I heard him bringing that in as part of a deal that he could then allow further US support to Ukraine from.
Maxim, a moment ago you mentioned optics, and one of the really memorable images of this year has been that meeting at the Vatican between Donald Trump and President Zelensky at the event of the Pope's funeral. At that time, it was a very stunning image to see, and it did seem to give, with hindsight, real false hope, especially when it just spurred Sergei Lavrov to request a phone call almost the next day to speak to the American delegation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, if you look at the access that the Russians have had to US negotiators and the US administration compared to the access the Ukrainians have had, it is a completely different level. The number of times that Witkoff has met with Putin this year, I think it's 5 or 6. People don't get 5 or 6 audiences with Putin. It's really astonishing. And Witkoff hasn't even visited Ukraine. So a huge discrepancy there. And now you have Jared Kushner coming into the frame as well. These are people with business interests that are not really interested in longevity of a peace process. And the optics it's all about Donald Trump's wanting to get some kind of peace prize or some kind of recognition for solving this conflict. And he's not interested in whether it's a meaningful solution or a lasting solution, as long as he's got the prize in his hands.
And throughout all of this, it's been commented that no deal must be made without the Ukrainians being involved. And throughout it, we've seen the US talking directly with Russia. But then we got that moment, didn't we, in May, where the Ukrainians and the Russians were going to meet for the first time in Istanbul. And it wasn't quite what we expected.
Well, it wasn't, and I'm not surprised Vladimir Putin didn't turn up, because he would have felt that he'd been ambushed into that position, and therefore was working very fast in the background to try and undo himself from going to it. Zelensky was being very clever by saying, yes, I'll meet. Yes, I'll be there. Yes, I'm ready to be there. Bring Donald Trump in. Donald Trump felt uncomfortable because he had actually been ambushed by European leaders and Zelensky and put in a position which was against what he was, the support that he was providing to Putin, or tacit support he was providing to Putin. There was never going to be any chance of Putin ever turning up to that meeting.
And Maxim, you spoke to a Ukrainian diplomat, didn't you, who was there?
Yes, Sergei Kislitsa is the first deputy foreign minister, and he's in charge of the peace track in Ukraine's diplomatic circles. So he's heading that for Zelensky. Yeah, he was there and he was saying, we realized quite early on that we weren't going to get something meaningful from the Russians, and mostly because they didn't have any negotiating position. They just had what Putin had told them to say, and there was no way you could engage in the substance of the arguments because they weren't prepared to negotiate. The person who could negotiate, who could make decisions, wasn't there, and all the Russians in the delegation were afraid of being reported on to Putin, so they were all sticking to their strongest pro-Putin talking points. And they opened with a lecture on their kind of distorted history of Ukraine and Russia, and concluding by saying, look, we want to stop the bloodshed because we Russians are killing our brother Russians, and just denying from the offset the nationhood of Ukraine.
Philip, despite the repeated requests, which fell on deaf ears with the Russians for ceasefires, immediate ceasefires, unconditional ceasefires, there was a ceasefire unilaterally declared by President Putin for 72 hours to coincide with the Victory Day parade. I mean, that was something, wasn't it?
It was, and I think there's two reasons for that. The first reason was it was Putin saying to Donald Trump, yes, I'll do a ceasefire. But the principal reason behind it was Vladimir Putin was really concerned that the Ukrainians would attack his Victory Day parade. And he had got all of these other Putin supporting world leaders coming to that parade, and he wanted to ensure that it was secure. That's why he made this unprecedented self-declared 72-hour ceasefire, which President Zelensky sort of adhered to when it came to attacking Russia, because he didn't want to do anything that would have upset Donald Trump. But it shows that Putin can do it if he wants to.
And there was no spectacular Ukrainian operation. But then, at the beginning of June, we had Operation Spiderweb, Maxim. That was really a triumph of what Ukraine could do, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's an extraordinary demonstration of what modern technology can do and how it can do it very far from the battlefield, that you can remotely pilot drones using the internet connection, conceal them and attack from civilian lorries, what some of Russia's kind of best defended airfields. They had very, very good air defenses for long-range missile strikes, but they were unable to deal with the multitude of these very small drones flying at their strategic bombers. And this was a hugely important moment, I think, for the Ukrainians who'd been hammered by these bombers for the last few years. They live in fear of when these things take off because they know that they're going to launch 6 or 8 Kinjal missiles across the border at them. And they're always getting the alerts that these aircraft are preparing to take off. So to see them burning on the tarmac, I think, was really something special for the Ukrainians, and a really big morale boost as well.
Planning.
Oh, this will have taken months. And as Zelensky was being ambushed in the Oval Office and Donald Trump was turning around and saying, "You have no cards." Yeah. Zelensky was going, "Well, I've got a full house in my hand, but I'm not going to tell you anything about it until it happens." And I think Operation Spider's Web proved that. And the Ukrainians have time after time after time proven that they've got these sort of very ambitious operations. And this is done by the Ukrainian HUR or GUR, their military intelligence organization, who've taken the Second World War Special Operations Executive type handbook and rewritten it into the modern era, and are having some significant successes.
Then later, Maxim, to rival the Oval Office encounter was this red carpet welcome for President Putin back on the world stage, welcomed by Donald Trump in Alaska. That really was a moment interpreted that he was welcome back on the world stage. I guess with hindsight, it was a bit of an appetizer of Trump's worldview laid out recently in the published US national security strategy.
I'll just point out that although lots of military intelligence operations are carried out by GUR, it's the SBU that carried out Operation Spiderweb, because my sources in the SBU would never let me forget it if I didn't give them credit for that. They spent a lot of time when we worked on a really interesting interactive piece that's still available, thanks to the SBU. Yes, the Alaska meeting was shocking. I mean, it was rolling out the red carpet for a dictator with blood on his hands, shaking those hands, and saying, all will be forgiven if we can come to some arrangement now. There was nothing. The Americans hadn't asked Putin to do anything to get that recognition. They hadn't. There were no preconditions for that meeting. So as a kind of a diplomatic maneuver, it was a very strange thing just to say the Russians can come back onto the world stage, be greeted with open arms, and they don't have to do anything. They don't have to change the way they're acting.
Really was a demonstration of Donald Trump's view that it's the personal, the bilateral relationships that counts in his world.
It was, but it was quite clear Vladimir Putin was in control.
Yeah.
He wasn't intimidated by the F-22 fighter jets he had to walk past. Whenever it came to the press conference at the end of it, Putin was looking confident. Trump wasn't looking confident, and Putin knew he was back in the world stage again, and therefore he had control from a diplomatic perspective, and arguably hasn't lost it since then.
Then came August, Maxim, in August as well, when the Russian fuel shortages tipped into a crisis for the Kremlin after the intensification of Ukrainian drone strikes. And you wrote about the Ukrainian drone battalions wiping out oil refineries multiple times this year. Can you just take us through how you've seen Ukraine's long-range air campaign evolve during the year?
Yeah, it's fascinating because there was a capability that we didn't think Ukraine really had, was to strike back at the Russians deep in the rear in the way that the Russians were using kind of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles at the Ukrainians. And they developed this drone program with actually several different manufacturers and a lot of support from the West actually in developing these long-range drones. I went on a mission where we saw these Luti drones being launched, and they flew all the way across the Black Sea, and then they hit the port of Tuapse and hit oil refinery infrastructure there. And it was a very interesting way to see that the way that special forces operations, these guys that were running this were all special forces operators who'd moved into the drone business. It was a very organized, very precise thing based on a lot of intelligence, a lot of Western intelligence sharing to identify where the Russians' defenses were and how the Ukrainians could maneuver their aircraft, and they would also use decoys. And it was a combined attack, often, with HIMARS or ATACMS missiles. Storm Shadows as well were involved. So there was a big, overwhelming attack of the kind that the Russians had already been launching on Ukraine for a couple of years. So it was fascinating to meet the guys behind this and to hear about their collaboration, their cooperation with Western intelligence. And see how effective they could be. These are not sophisticated aircraft, really. They are wings with a propeller and a bomb attached, but guided by satellite using GPS. And the Ukrainians have been able to scale this up because of that, and significantly now start to I think they've attacked almost all of Russia's oil refineries at least once, and some of them several times. They're now hitting port infrastructure, Novorossiysk, again and again and again. And it seems to be something the Russians are really struggling to deal with.
But matched by Russian strikes on Ukraine's infrastructure, energy infrastructure, repeatedly throughout the year.
Yeah, the Russians have continued to hit the energy infrastructure that's supporting the Ukrainian civilians. They've still got this idea that they can break the will of the Ukrainians by freezing them during the winter. The Ukrainians are attacking Russia's ability to continue to fund the war. So slightly different target sets or rationale behind why they're hitting them.
But that Maxim, that was what made it so much more painful to the Ukrainian public, wasn't it? When that corruption scandal erupted about money being siphoned off Ukraine's energy company. At the moment, do you think that has actually died down, that scandal, and has the current administration, the current government, survived it?
I think Ukrainians are going to be reminded of it every time they go to switch the lights on and it's not working. Ukrainians I'm speaking to now will have 4 to 6 hours electricity a day. Sometimes have to get up in the middle of the night to start charging batteries to keep the day going. It is a really critical situation, and everyone is feeling the pain of not having electricity in this cold winter, and it's still several months to go. Even when I was there, we try and stay places with generators, but sometimes the generators fail and you end up having no hot water and it's freezing temperatures, and just trying to go about your daily business, have a shower and things like that. It becomes very complicated and depressing. And I think that some Ukrainians, if it goes on, will think about, is it time to leave the country and go, another wave of refugees going to Europe, because it's so difficult right now. Obviously, there is the endurance. People have found a way to adapt to it. They've got batteries. All businesses have purchased generators now. But it's they'll constantly be reminded of that scandal and the fact that the government could have done more to protect these substations, and didn't do it. And the reason they didn't do it was not because it was too expensive for the budget. It was because the people that were in charge were not receiving the kickbacks that they wanted from the contractors. And this was an incredibly frustrating story for me because I wrote about it last year. But there were no blackouts then, so there was no massive outcry about it at the time. And it was British engineers that went to help Ukraine design these protection for the substations, and British involvement had allowed and found lots of innovative ways to protect the electricity grid, and then just wasn't used, and the contractors were ready to build them, but weren't being commissioned because they weren't paying the kickbacks.
We said at the beginning, Philip, that we would talk a little bit about how the war would be felt beyond Ukraine's borders. And then in September was this stunning event where 19 unarmed drones entered Polish airspace, and it prompted a response by the Polish to another NATO aircraft to shoot, I should say, at least 3 down. I mean, this really was a moment where it shook NATO, didn't it?
It did, and that was the start of almost a little campaign by the Russians to test different countries' security status and NATO's resolve politically. So we had the Shahad drones going into Polish airspace, of which some had to be shot down. And then we've had other drone sightings across critical national infrastructure in Sweden, Denmark, Germany, and elsewhere, and combined with enhanced Russian spy ships activity across our critical infrastructure, undersea critical infrastructure, and elsewhere. And this has really rocked NATO and rocked different countries. And Russia was doing it from an intelligence gathering perspective to see how different countries could react. To send a message to different countries saying we can get through any defences you have, and then to sit and watch what the reaction was, and to watch what the political reaction would be, and see if there was any fracture points that Putin could then identify and then come in and try and widen those.
And then moving on, Maxim, to October, Donald Trump, we've been wondering throughout the year if he would use leverage against Putin to try and bring him to the negotiating table. And he slapped these sanctions on the Rosneft and Lukoil companies, which together account directly or indirectly for about 2/3 of Russia's oil exports. I mean, it was regarded as a bold move at the time, or it certainly was in the media. More than 3 weeks, though, now after secondary sanctions were due to be levied there, there are reports that countries like China and India are actually increasing their imports of Russian oil.
Yeah, I mean, it was surprising because it went against the grain of what Donald Trump was doing, and I think everyone thought that maybe this is a sign that he is getting frustrated with Putin and he is prepared to put leverage on Putin in order to force through a peace deal. But actually, in the weeks past, we've seen that the US has granted exemptions to a lot of subsidiaries of Lukoil and Rosneft, which already renders those sanctions less effective. And the other big problem with the sanctions at the moment is if you gut the FBI and you put only your kind of political appointees in place and you don't have anyone dedicated to counterintelligence against the Russians in the FBI, or you have anyone dedicated to enforcing sanctions in the Treasury, or not big enough teams, it doesn't really matter if you put legislative sanctions on people. And this is something that the US was leading on, was really enforcing sanctions very well, and has basically stopped doing that. And it's something that the Europeans also and the UK should be taking up the slack on, but are also really under-resourcing sanctions enforcement.
And this is where it stimulated the Ukrainians. And President Zelensky has said, we'll impose our own sanctions on Russia. And he was saying that when they first started attacking the Russian oil refineries, their oil storage and everything else. But now it's turned into the Ukrainians attacking the shadow fleet of ships that are going around. We've seen at least 2 hit in the Black Sea. We've seen others hit in different parts of the world. And this is something that will potentially step up for.
I'm wondering if that's going to be something that's become very much a theme of next year. Maxim, November, we saw the sentencing of a Ukrainian citizen for assassinating a Ukrainian activist. And a lot was revealed about the bizarre way that many of these assassinations have been orchestrated by the Kremlin. You've been writing about this, haven't you, Maxim? What should we watch for next in this kind of campaign?
Well, I think the Kremlin playbook is established. They look for disaffected people on the internet and these Telegram channels, people who particularly like kind of anti-Ukrainian content in this instance, or people who are frustrated with conscription or mobilization and comment about what the government is doing in social fora, and then they target a whole range of them. First with bot messaging, just seeing if they get a response. And then, if as they develop a relationship, we'll bring a kind of actual FSB handler into discussing what measures they can do in order to undermine Ukraine. And that will start with something like graffiti, something, and they'll get some cryptocurrency for it. And then as they become used to accepting payments and getting the payments for these small activities, they gradually escalate into ultimately potentially sabotage or assassinating someone. And we've actually seen this playing out in Europe as well, with the kind of the Wagner group recruiting people to burn arms warehouses in the UK and across Europe. We've seen disaffected youth, the Kremlin seems to delight in particularly targeting Ukrainians. So, I mean, they can do it because of the language, but also when you get someone who's accused of burning Keir Starmer's car, and then it turns out that they're Ukrainians, this is a propaganda gift for the Kremlin.
You're nodding away there, Philip.
Yes, it's part of the information campaign that's out there, and it's recruiting, as Maxim said, the disaffected Ukrainians out of there, knowing full well that'll go back on them again. But interestingly, the assassination, the way the Russians came in, they managed to convince the individual that they'd recruited that it was Ukrainian intelligence that had recruited him, and he was doing a favor for them. It's good old Russian playbook. It's the stuff that they're actually very, very good at.
Yeah. So as the year draws to a close, and we were talking about it at the beginning, the media space dominated by this flurry of diplomatic activity, started with the 28-point plan, favourable to Russia, conveniently emerged as was claiming dominance on the battlefield. Now as this 20-point, I don't even know where we're at with it. There's 20-point plan now, which has been revised and revised again and rejected again. I mean, still, though, the fundamental disagreements are there. Donbas, what happens to it? Do you see there's going to be any kind of breakthrough on these discussions, Maxim, in the coming weeks whatsoever? Or are we just going to be going round again and the war continues?
Well, the Ukrainians will certainly not withdraw their troops from the Donbas without getting something significant in return. And what Zelensky seems to be determined to get, and what he's been promised by European partners, is some kind of troop presence in Western Ukraine, and some military guarantees in exchange for that. Because I think the Ukrainians know full well that it won't end with, even if they surrender the Donbas, it wouldn't end there. It would be the Donbas being a launch pad for attacking other Ukrainian regions. So they're going to need something significant in order to give it up. I think, a lot of the soldiers who've been fighting in the Donbas since 2014 will not want to give it up and might even refuse to go back, the volunteer battalions. And Russia is not going to accept any kind of peacekeeping force from Western countries in the region. So it seems like it's still a very difficult thing to solve.
Can I just ask you something that someone was telling me only today? Some of the talk, the chatter they were saying was coming out of Kyiv was that President Putin, he wants his victory parade in Kramatorsk, and then he might settle and stop the fighting, bide his time, build relations with the Trump administration for the next few years, in order to perhaps resume again at a later stage. Have you heard anything along those lines, or is that just chitter-chatter rumour at the moment?
I tend to think that wouldn't happen, because I don't think Putin is a man with a lot of time for the ambitions that he has. I mean, I think he waited 10 years of kind of this hybrid invasion in the Donbas to see if he could get it. It wasn't working. And he feels like he's an older guy that's running out of time, and he wants to achieve his Tsarist ambitions before he goes. So even if he waits a kind of 6 months or a year, he's still going to come back, I think, and try and subjugate Ukraine completely.
I think so too, then.
Oh, very, very much so. Putin thinks he's winning militarily at the moment, and he hasn't changed his stance one jot when it comes to the peace negotiations.
Let's just now finally look back at the entirety of the year. Are there any events or moments for you, Maxim, that you can look at and try and get an idea from those events what 2026 is going to look like?
Yeah, I think, the Ukrainians have seen what the Trump administration is interested in and what they're focused on, and is going to have to continue to try and play this peace game just to keep the Americans interested in this war, because the danger is that Trump walks away entirely, and things like the purchase agreements where Europe can buy American weapons might just evaporate, intelligence sharing would stop. So they don't want the Americans to walk away completely, and they're going to have to try really hard to keep these negotiations going, even if they don't believe that it's going to come to anything. And that's one of the kind of the bizarre features that we've seen this year, and I expect that to continue next year. I think that we'll continue seeing incremental Russian advances. There will still be big problems with mobilization, and something I wrote about in my last piece was the rate of desertions now in Ukraine is very alarming, and the Ukrainian government is going to have to do something to tackle those desertions, increase punishments, cut people off from social security and benefits and other things, in order to keep the war going. I mean, they've also had this outflux of young men, 22 to 24, who were allowed to leave the country, and leading to the Germans complaining about them. So they're also going to have to do something about that. And they're going to need, I think, more operations like Spider's Web, more operations in the Black Sea, things that can lift Ukrainian spirits, particular moments. I think Kupiansk has done that a little bit for now. It's inspiring to see that the Ukrainians can completely surround the Russians once they claim to have taken a town. But it's difficult to see going into winter what the next technological breakthrough will be, because those are the things that have really made an important difference. I think the use of AI is going to be a theme of next year. We've already seen some artificial intelligence on the battlefield, and the person who can use AI effectively without causing kind of friendly fire incidents and at scale is probably going to have the upper hand next year.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Putin's coming under increasing pressure from himself and others. But the one statistic that he hates being quoted at him is, if you compare his advances in Ukraine since the start of the war in 2022 to what the Russians did during the Second World War, and we're almost at exactly the same length of time. In the Second World War, the Russians pushed the Germans back from just outside Moscow to just outside Berlin. They've advanced about 40 or 50 kilometers in the same time inside Ukraine. That is a measure of the success of that Ukraine has had as a much smaller military, a much smaller nation, in holding back the might of the Russians the whole way through. Next year, we're going to see an increasing number of audacious attacks like Operation Spider's Web. The Ukrainians are going to attack the operational level, Russia's ability to continue to fund the war more, and attack those targets on a global basis, as we've seen with the Shadow Fleet attacks.
And that seems the perfect point to leave it for this discussion. It's been so good speaking to you and catching up with you. Maxim, I know you'll be out to Ukraine again very soon. Look forward to speaking to you soon. Have a good break while you can. Philip, always good to see you.
Good to sit next to you as well.
And you've got a piece coming out tomorrow, haven't you, where you're looking at the battlefield, the whole in detail, in granular detail, with the Institute for the Study of War. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's coming out tomorrow.
But get the editing doing. Okay, good to see you, and we'll see you again very soon.